Hello, I'm Dan Rust, Head of Global Leadership Development for Infopro Learning. Over the past 3 years, our research, development, and instructional design team has been focused on senior leaders and what separates those who successfully move into strategic organizational leadership roles from those whose careers seem to top out at the functional level, leading a department, a division, a team. We've also focused on leaders who successfully navigate their organizations through times of change, uncertainty, and ambiguity. And the result of our efforts is a program called Strategic Leadership, with 14 hours of content, typically delivered over the course of 7 weeks. Now, expecting leaders to sit through 14 hours of content, I know, is a big ask. But the truth is, we're addressing big issues, and there are no quick, simple, easy answers. Recently, a client asked me to summarize the 14 hours of content into 45 minutes or less, which was also in its own way a big ask. But I did, and I recorded it, so if you want a deeper dive into our strategic leadership program and you're free for the next 45 minutes, you can watch it now. The original conception of this program began with a series of conversations with C-suite leaders and other senior leaders where in some cases we surveyed them, in some cases we had direct conversations, but the essence of the project was asking them, what shifted in your mind as you made the transition from a high-performing functional leader to a strategic leadership role? Whether that happened when you arrived at the C-suite or on your way to the C-suite, or even if you are an existing functional leader, what has shifted over time in your mindset? And what many of them told us was a lot of the mental shifts, a lot of the new thinking had to be self-developed. These were hard-won lessons for many of them to move beyond my functional expertise and my functional domain to stepping back to think about the organization overall, to think about the organization within the context of the world, the market, even to think about things like our people judgments and people decisions from a more strategic context as opposed to just individual, what are the jobs and what jobs need to be filled and who's the best person to fill them. We gathered a lot of great information and also some amazing best practices from many of the people that we interviewed. And then we put a development team to work. And ultimately, because we knew we wanted to deliver this primarily as a virtual learning journey. Certainly, we have delivered it as a classroom experience, but given not just the pandemic, but the nature of our world right now, virtual delivery was part of what we knew we wanted to do. We also knew that delivering 14 hours, if you see what's on the screen, this is 14 hours of content. Delivering that to senior level leaders was a big challenge because the content had to be incredibly relevant and valuable to them, or they simply weren't going to participate. And it had to be structured in a way where they felt they were a part of the experience, not just sitting and being a sponge. So from that, we developed this model addressing these elements that you see on the screen here, starting with organizational culture, then moving to people decisions, then strategy development. And we separated planning and execution, and you'll hear why in a moment when we go through some of that content. And then after planning and execution, shifting to change acceleration, which is delivered in a way that is pretty much universal wherever you might happen to be in your business journey. Whatever changes you might be looking to drive, we provide a lot of tools and processes related to accelerating change. And then course correction. How do you notice what's working and what isn't, and then make course corrections and learn from whatever errors or mistakes. And then finally, crisis response. We don't give equal weight to every one of these topics. The greatest weight, and you'll see this as we go through the content, the greatest weight is given to strategy development. And strategy development, oftentimes, it doesn't get the weight that it deserves because it gets mixed in with planning and execution. And it's very easy to have a great executional plan that creates the illusion of a strategy. But goals and execution don't equal strategy. They equal a really good execution plan. So we'll cover that in more detail. But the first module, module 1, begins with a focus on helping leaders think about their thinking. One of the things we identified in the high performing leaders that we were interviewing and observing was they had a unique ability to integrate three types of thinking: systems thinking, critical thinking, and strategic thinking. And we go through an exercise and a series of discussions where we help leaders think about their own thinking. We clarify what each of these three different modes are. And then throughout the program, there are places in every module where we step back and we ask them, how would you apply your systems, critical, strategic thinking to this particular problem, to this particular scenario, to this particular situation? So we continually reinforce this throughout the program. And I should mention that this is not a thorough slide by slide review. This is, I took each module and I picked two or three topics that I just felt were most indicative of the content of that module. So module one is about organizational culture. So we do, after introducing leaders to the thought process model and helping them think about their thinking, we then move into how do we ensure that the culture of our organization not only is a positive culture, but how do we ensure that it's aligned with our business objectives? Because there are many different versions of positive cultures. But we start with the basics, and these are the research-driven essentials. And we do go through an explanation of each of these points to help leaders understand not only what we mean, but what best in class means, what world class means in each of these 10 areas. And then we want to give leaders a bit of time to self-reflect, because many leaders do not appreciate how much they themselves, just by who they are, they create the culture of the organization. It almost, I'm not going to say it doesn't matter what your mission statement is or your vision statement or what you've got posted on the walls. What matters more than anything else is what's being expressed and lived by your actual leaders from the front line all the way up to the C-suite. So we go through a series of self-awareness discussions and exercises. One of those exercises is called the butterfly effect, where we give some examples of a leader who made a simple little comment, who did a simple little thing. And these are all real world examples of how a simple offhanded comment ended up creating lots of implications and actions on the organization. And all the leader did was say, hey, I can't read that report. It was interpreted as, I don't understand the report. But what had actually happened is the leader forgot his eyeglasses. And yet the misinterpretation caused a team of people to go and reconfigure a report because they thought they needed to make it more understandable. So we share some examples like that, but we also give leaders an opportunity to reflect. And then we apply systems critical and strategic thinking to organizational culture. We go through a brainstorming exercise where we ask leaders to think about what questions should we be asking and answering related to our culture. What you see on the screen here are the typical answers that ultimately result. But we don't start with these answers. We start with the question, and we make them a part of this. They co-create the questions with us. Now, there is a quote unquote right answer or a set of right answers, and the facilitator does ultimately guide them to some version of these particular questions, plus potentially additional questions that they might think of. So in the same moment that we're reinforcing this integrated approach to thinking, we're also reinforcing what should you as a leader be observing, be looking for when it comes to organizational culture. And then we also make the point during this module that in this 2-hour session, we are not going to be solving any of your root problems related to organizational culture. We are going to be creating a lot of thought within you. We're going to be helping you understand what you should be asking, what you should be thinking, but this is not a problem-solving session. If you have organizational culture challenges, you probably will need days to or longer to actually dive deeply into this. But we want to leave you with a great thought process to apply, whether you are applying that to your team of 3 people or a team of 300 or 300,000. You'll come away with a thought process to apply to the culture that you are responsible for. So that is the first session. Participants are given a homework assignment, which is just a thinking assignment. One of the things we learned about senior leaders is they don't do homework. They don't have time,
They don't have
and
time. Yeah. To their
and
defense, I have to say they don't have time.
and no one calls them to account. It's really a combination. No one ever says, "Hey, you can't come into this room until your homework's done." So we accept that reality. What we know they will do is they will think, and we give them a thought exercise. And when they come into the second session, we ask them to share some of their insights and thoughts that they have been reflecting upon from the previous session. From there, we actually get pretty good engagement, and it starts the second session off on a really positive note. So
You
the
can,
second session is about people decisions.
yeah.
And
You could also introduce a competition if you want them to do some homework. Then
absolutely.
people.
um, when one leader shares a deep insight and it is actually pretty profound or interesting, and the facilitator says that's an amazing insight, it immediately creates in others a desire for the same ultimate impact. So the way we gain engagement at the beginning of the session on hiring decisions is we ask, and these are relatively senior leaders. They've all had successful hires in their past, but they've also all had mistakes, all made mistakes, or had hires that didn't work out. And we spend after we do a reflection on the previous session, then we move into a section on reflecting on your past hiring misjudgments. Now, there may have been things that you couldn't know, that you weren't aware of. So we're not saying that the hiring mistake was necessarily your fault, but we would like you to share with each other hiring missteps, either that you were personally a part of or that you observed or are aware of. Let's just spend some time talking about what has happened, and to the degree that you understand why, share with us why. This ends up being a very engaged discussion. Once leaders feel like this is a safe place, I can say, well, 4 years ago, yeah, here was the position I was hiring for, and here's what happened. So we end up with 2 or 3 stories of generally, hiring missteps. And when you're doing this virtually, you can see the other leaders nodding. I mean, we all empathize with this, where you have an important position, you think you've got the right person. After the most common scenario is we hired someone we felt great about. We knew in the first 30 days something was amiss, and it took us a year and a half before we finally pulled the trigger. You hear these scenarios again and again, and so then we transition into, let's peel the layers away and try to understand why that occurs. And one of the reasons, not the entire reason, but one of the reasons is, as leaders, we do have bias blind spots. We're not talking about racial bias. We're talking about normal human mental blind spots. We talk about some of these types of biases. Affinity bias, where you tend to like people who are more like you. Overconfidence bias. If you've made a series of really great hiring decisions, that overconfidence can create a blind spot where you believe in your own instinct as opposed to your process. So we don't spend a lot of time on this, but the real point we're trying to make here is there are lots of complexities that can contribute to a less than optimal hiring decision. And so then we introduce them to a process for very thoughtfully using your critical thinking skills to ensure you're getting the right person in the right seat. So we use this model called, getting right person, right person, wrong seat, wrong person, right seat. And we go through and we assess how do you determine if you've got the right person in the right seat, or what do you do if you've got the right person but they're in the wrong seat? The right person is the person who shares your values, has all of the basic human characteristics that you really want in a colleague, but they're just not a fit functionally for that specific seat, that specific role. It's a tough situation because we can't always find an appropriate seat for that person. But we talk leaders through these four elements: right person, wrong seat, right person, right seat, and ultimately wrong person, wrong seat. That's the easy one. But even the easy one, we asked leaders, how many of you currently today have an employee who, if they resigned next week, you would secretly feel relieved? You would feel like, okay, now I have an opportunity to make a move that would be good for the to do something different with that role, with that seat, with that position. At least 50% of the hands raise or people nod their heads. So even wrong person, wrong seat is sometimes challenging in the real world of execution. So we talk about that. We talk about what's the reality of why that is so difficult when it would seem to be a relatively straightforward decision. So the people decisions module is 2 hours. And again, leaders are left with a lot to think about. In the participant guide, all of the notes, all of the critical points are included. And we, again, give them a thought exercise. When they come back to the next session, we ask them, and generally, when they come back to the strategy development section, they've been thinking a lot about their people, about their structure, about their, right person, wrong seat, right person, right seat. And we don't have enough time for all of their sharing. But there's clearly been generally a lot of thinking going on about their people judgments and people decisions. Then we move into the third module, which is on strategy development. And strategy development, our approach, or I would say our point of view regarding strategy development, is somewhat unique. It was very much informed by the leaders who were sharing with us their practical, real world approach to strategy development. And it starts with understanding that we exist in a VUCA world, and that in a VUCA world, it's not enough to just do annual strategy development and then assume your strategy won't be revisited until 12 months from now, or perhaps even longer. In a volatile, uncertain world, strategy has to be agile. Development and adjustment has to be agile. So we have this model for strategy creation and strategy implementation, and we separate the two. So the analyze and synthesize stages are the focus of this 2 hour session, and they're the focus of the majority of the next 2 hour session. So the majority of our time is going to be spent on analyze and synthesize as a part of strategy creation. So again, we go through a thinking exercise where we ask them, what questions should you be asking strategically, critically, from a system standpoint? And what I've got on the screen here are some of the questions that the facilitator guides them to, because these are, in fact, I'm going to say the right questions. These are the core fundamental questions you need to be asking as you're developing a strategy. We again make the point here that this is not a session where you are going to be fully developing or redeveloping or reimagining your own business strategy. You may take some of these thoughts and take some of this process and apply it to your business. Some of you are going to be in roles where this is actually part of your responsibility. Some of you may be contributors to this within your business. And for some of you, this may be something that you will be involved in the future. So our goal is to provide you with a process and with thinking and help align your point of view related to strategy development, as opposed to this being a problem-solving workshop where we're going to completely re-engineer company XYZ's strategy. One of the key points in getting your head around the purpose of strategy development is to think about the gap between customer value that you create through your products and services and your costs. That gap between your costs and the customer value created is really the essence of business. There has to be a gap. There has to be a gap between in order to have profit, in order to run a business. Well, when you compare your value cost gap to your competitors' value cost gap, part of strategy development is identifying how are you either going to reduce your costs or increase your perceived value with customers in order to have a bigger gap than your competitors. Because if you operate with the same gap as your competitors, if there is no greater value to cost differential, you're not going to have a reason to compete. You're not going to have a reason to win. So we go through this. We spend a fair amount of time on this model just to help leaders understand that this is something that senior leaders have on their mind all the time. It's a never-ending thought process where you're looking for opportunities to reduce costs without reducing value, or increase value with only a minimal increase in costs, with an understanding that perceived value is as important as actual value. Are there ways to increase perceived value, again, without increasing costs? And so we have a discussion with the leaders. What is our current winning value proposition? And the reason we use the term winning is you can have a value proposition, but it's got to win competitively. So we call it the winning value proposition because it has to be the value proposition that wins in a competitive landscape. And so we have leaders break out into small groups. They have a guided discussion. They come back. They share their insights related to the existing. Oftentimes what they'll say is, well, we know our existing value proposition. It's these 3 bullet points that they've all memorized. They begin to think that through that, and we do ask, how long has it been since you've reviewed, assessed, thought through how effective is your value proposition in the existing marketplace? And we're simply asking them to talk about it. We're not necessarily saying it should be this or it should be that. We're asking them to have an engaged dialogue and answer the question, is it adequate? Sometimes the answer is yes, sometimes no, sometimes we're not sure. And the critical thinking question is, how do you know? And it's an important question. How do we gauge the current effectiveness of our value proposition? Again, it's more about helping them with the thinking than coming up with the specific answers today. But we do ask leaders to rate their current method of strategic planning. And whether you're doing strategic planning for your division, your department, your team, for the overall organization, um, we rank approaches to strategy and planning on a scale of 1 to 5. Organizations that would be a 1, they essentially just do planning. They do planning, goal setting and execution plans, and they review them once a year. And you can see what's on the screen here. Number 2 is they do goal setting and execution strategies with the execution planning with a little bit of strategy, and they review it once a year. Number 3, they combine strategy and planning together, but not necessarily equally. And again, they review once a year. If you go all the way to number 5, this is the best practice approach that we observed in the high-performing senior leaders that we interviewed and that we were able to spend some significant time with. They view strategy and planning as separate processes, but they're equally robust. So they put a huge amount of depth into their strategy development, and then an equally huge amount of depth into the execution plan related to that strategy development. And they do have an annual cadence, but it's reviewed quarterly. They have a very a strict approach to doing a quarterly review. So they're constantly gauging, is our strategy adequate for the market today, adequate for the market now? And they have this agile approach to strategy development. And rather than ever making huge changes, they make micro changes because they are reviewing it so frequently. So we have this discussion with leaders. The leaders will rate their high level of assessment of their current approach. We're not looking to judge anyone. We're not looking to judge any organization. We're just looking to create some awareness of what best practices are, particularly in a volatile environment or a VUCA environment. And then I'm not going to over verbalize a couple of these slides that come up, but we do make a point that what we see in high performing strategic organizations is they are highly adaptive. So they are looking for, they're doing experimenting, they're trying things, they're observing what's working, what isn't working, and they adapt very quickly. So we use the theory of natural selection as sort of a metaphor. The challenge with nature is nature adapts without awareness. nature just throws out, a million different variations, and of the million, three of them live and reproduce. So that's where the variation goes. As humans, though, we can add a thought process to our adaptation, so we don't have to throw out a million variations. Um, but when it comes to being an adaptive strategic organization, there are 5 critical competencies, and we talk through these. We help leaders self-assess where they and where their organization is right now in terms of these critical competencies, and we give them, again, more food for thought regarding where there might be room for further development in one or more of these areas. And then the final point we make at the end of this particular 2-hour session is that the strategy development process can mobilize these theories of evolutionary development so that you are consistently agile in your overall approach. So now, actually, in terms of the timeline, I'm into the 4th 2-hour session now. So we started strategy development in the 3rd 2-hour session. We continue into the 4th 2-hour session. So we go more deeply into situational awareness. How do you truly deeply analyze your organization? Not necessarily, again, looking for all of the answers in this session, but giving them the thought process. And we do talk about their business. We have a lot of conversations about their business, but you can only go so deep in a 2-hour session. One of the models we use is the portfolio profitability map. We share with leaders, how do you take your current set of services and products and any other value creation element and divide it into one of these 4 categories? And then depending upon the category that it's in, it can determine how much you invest or reinvest in that particular category, or what do you pull off the shelf? What do you pull away? So again, just a thought prompting exercise. And then we move on to, how do you take all of the information that you're taking in and convert it into insights? Because information is not insight. Information is just data. And insights help you. Insights are those things that you see that potentially your competitors don't see or that others don't see. So you take all of this information and synthesize it down into what that means is X. And we share some examples of insights from other businesses. But here is where we ask them to think a little more deeply about their own business and generate insights. And one of the points we make is that with almost every insight in a business, there comes a point where the insight is obvious, where the strength of the signal is really strong, and everybody gets that we have to do X. Well, at that point where the signal strength is so strong, it's really no longer an insight. In fact, everybody gets it, so it's simply an obvious move that we have to make. The value of insights is when they're not obvious, and gauging when you take action on a signal that you're seeing. We're sensing this in the marketplace. We're hearing this from our employees. We're hearing this from our customers. Our regulators seem to be doing this. You get this, this feedback that's coming into you, these signals that are coming into you. You don't want to take action on every signal just because one customer says X or because one employee says X. But when those signals start to seem like they have some substance to them before they become obvious, that's where leadership actually occurs. And so this is a great conversation that we have with senior leaders. We ask them to share with us any examples of signals that they're hearing now that they think they might need to take action on, or maybe they've been delaying because they're really not sure whether that signal is valid or not. We just have this conversation, and it's a great thought prompter, and it is an area where they just start to talk about their own business and some areas where, hey, what I'm seeing is this, or what we're hearing is this. Maybe we don't want to wait until it's whatever it is obvious to us and the rest of the world. So then, as we come close to wrapping up this portion on strategy development, we pull all of the various concepts together to help them make sense of all of this. Our competitive focus, are creating greater customer value, identifying the few key priorities that that a business is going to truly invest resources or time into. How do you decide where your organization focuses? Because most businesses don't have the budget to boil the ocean, to do everything, to take action on every great idea. So you do have to align your key priorities with your winning value proposition, with your competitive focus, etc. And so we talk through this model, and again, this generally generates a very business specific conversation, some dialogue between the leaders before we move into planning and execution. So I'm just going to take a breath here, because we've spent now, in the course of this program, almost 4 hours on strategy development. And within the participant guide itself, all of the processes, all of the prompters are captured, because what we hear from many leaders is, this is great. Hey, we probably should have done this last November because we were getting ready for our annual planning. Or we should do a review of this coming September, way of almost cementing the process into their minds before we finally wrap up and go back and reference the next time they're actually getting into strategy development. So then we move into planning and execution. And as we said on a previous slide, planning and execution needs to be equally robust. And planning and execution involves a broad range of things. So we talk through, how do you align your internal processes, your structure, your people, your incentives, all of the things you see on the screen. How do you align all of these with this winning value proposition and this overall market strategy that you've created? How do you identify gaps and ensure that, because there are going to be gaps, if you say, when it comes to our business structure, we're really right now not properly structured to address certain market conditions. So that would be a gap. Now, what do you do with those gaps? Our advice is, number one, you accept the brutal reality that you have gaps, and then you attach a team that is assigned to the gap. So if you have a process gap, if you have a systems and measures gap, whatever gaps you've identified, you assign a team that owns the gap, and they will report back to you or a team quarterly regarding their progress on the gap. If gaps don't have owners, gaps tend to just sort of live on and only very slowly close. Oftentimes they don't close at all if they don't have someone who really owns the task of eventually closing the gap. So to create a good execution plan, you have to identify your key priorities, identify your gaps, do everything in alignment with your winning value proposition, and also ensure that your plan is in alignment with your overall business ecosystem. So this is where we do have to talk about the individual client organization, their existing business ecosystem, and how do we align your execution plan with your existing ecosystem. And then finally, for this session, we know that an adaptive culture is a high performance culture. So how do you ensure that in your process of executing the plan, you aren't just creating soldiers who march blindly forward? That's not what you want. As much as you want a robust and specific execution plan, you want the individuals who are marching forward to be adaptive, to be recognizing what's working and what isn't working. You want thinking, sentient human beings, not just blind soldiers. So we talk about what kind of people are going to help you drive your execution plan, but do it in an adaptive way. So that is, again, the essence. I'm way oversimplifying it, but that is the essence of that particular module. Then we move into change acceleration, and there are two golden rules for successful implementation of a strategy. As I said before, number one, mobilize gap teams, and number two, making sure that all levers of your business system are aligned to support the strategy. But we do know that sometimes in business, we are trapped by frozen mental models, and sometimes these mental models get in the way of the change that we are trying to drive. So to help people get somewhat unstuck from potentially frozen mental models, we introduce them to something called the sigmoid curve. And this is a classic curve that's addressed in most MBA programs. Essentially, an organization goes through a growth phase, and in their growth phase where everything is going really well, everything is successful, we assume our model is working because it's working. We're generating revenues, we're generating profits. And many of these organizations, they don't notice the early signals that what was working before isn't working as well now. And if you don't notice those early signals, you just keep doing what you've been doing. And then pretty soon performance starts to dip. You find reasons, you find excuses. It can't be the model. It can't be our business model because our business model is working so well for 30 years. It must be something else. And it's only when the business results really start to dip that organizations say to themselves, oh man, something's got to change. The bridge is burning. We're going to have to create a new bridge. What we recommend is if you can, again, pay attention to those early signals, this is where strategic leadership really creates value, where the strategic leader, when the signals are weak, starts to see that we need to begin to evolve. We need to begin to adjust something so that you can get ahead of the sigmoid curve and, in fact, be on to your next phase of growth before you ever experience the big downturn from your old plan or your old approach not producing the results that it used to produce. So we introduce leaders to this model. We share a few real world examples, and then we ask them, what thoughts does this prompt? And oftentimes when you combine this with the value of early signals, with the danger of being trapped in frozen mental models, man, we've given them a lot to think about. So we give them a breakout exercise just to discuss and absorb and integrate this into your thinking before coming back and sharing some of your insights with the full group. And then assuming you are wanting to move, you are wanting to drive some type of organizational change, and assuming that the strategy, whatever strategy you've developed, is going to require some kind of change, because frankly, almost every great, compelling strategy does involve some degree of change within an organization. Because if it doesn't require change, if it's simply, hey, our strategy is to keep doing what we've been doing, that'll work for a while. But as we saw with the sigmoid curve, eventually it will produce suboptimal results. Probably the biggest driver of the suboptimal results, I'm going to back up a second, is if you're in the middle of the sigmoid curve and things are working really well, your competitors are paying attention. And whatever those high profit products are, whatever those high profit services are, whatever you are doing that is driving high growth and high profitability, even if the market is not changing, there are people watching and paying attention, and there'll be new competitors entering the market, and suddenly the market dynamics will create that sigmoid curve for you, even if the customers or market aren't changing at all. So how we go through some content on how you actually take a strategy and translate it into a compelling leadership message. And then assuming some kind of change is being driven. Now, change can be process change, systems change, cultural change, people change. There are a broad range of changes that can occur. Change management itself can be its own 2, 3, 5-day program. So in 2 hours, we introduce leaders to our change management model, and then we provide them with a change acceleration, what we call toolkit. And the toolkit is it's a PDF file that has over 80 different change management tools. These are forms, processes that can be used for a variety of purposes. If you're pulling a team together and you need to create a charter for that team, there's a form on creating a compelling charter. If you, I don't have time to go through all of the details of it, but it's a toolkit that every leader takes away from this program, and the PDF files are structured so that it's one workbook, one PDF, but within the PDFs, you can click a button and pull out any separate sheet or any separate form and email it to your colleagues if you ever want everyone wanting to work on a particular form, a particular process. So we have a toolkit for a variety of change acceleration situations. Assuming you have, you've completed the change acceleration module, then we move into the course correction module. There are going to be times where, as you're implementing your strategy, if you are really paying attention and you're doing these regular reviews, you're going to be iterating and experimenting throughout your execution cycle. That's what it means to be an agile organization in a VUCA environment. So we talk through what that looks like, what that means, and how to become comfortable with failure, because you want to build out an execution plan that drives towards success, but you also want to be trying a few stretch projects, stretch exercises, stretch approaches that are minimal in risk, but maximal in potential value, either through the learnings or the actual profitability. So we talk about iterating and experimenting. And how do you learn from those experiments? You can learn from others. You can learn from the experiments that other companies are making, and you can learn from your own errors and mistakes. And that learning is a key part of an adaptive organization. And part of that learning is doing what the military calls after action reviews. And so the reason I have the photo of the military is it was originally a military term. After action review would occur after there was a major military engagement, and the on the ground frontline team would do an after action review. And the key in the military was brutal honesty. There was never any covering up of, hey, who did what, who's responsible for what. It was brutal honesty because their lives were on the line. Well, we recommend the exact same thing in a business context. When you're going to do an after action review, everyone has to be comfortable just being upfront regarding what worked, what didn't, uh, who was accountable for what, and people make mistakes. Sometimes people make misjudgments, and it has to be okay to have a brutally honest after action review. And everyone has to know my career's not on the line because I made this call and it turns out that was less than optimal. We have to have an environment where people are comfortable with a brutally honest after action review. And then finally, we have a module on crisis response. The challenge, of course, with a crisis response is you suddenly find yourself dealing with something that's fully unexpected. So how do you train somebody to be prepared for the unpredictable? Well, we share some good insights and approaches, but mostly we share resources with them. We take them through a crisis response process and help them understand, in many ways, you're simply applying the same situational analysis that you learned earlier, but you're doing it rapidly, because in a crisis response, usually time is critical. So we go through a similar brief situational analysis process. And we've also learned that action planning in a crisis it's critical to work the problem, uh, not necessarily work the emotions around the problem. So we give them a process for defining the problem, examining the external environment, examining the internal realities, and then defining an action plan. And we share a couple of examples, and then we share a few examples internally from the client organization regarding crises that have occurred that were either handled well or handled perhaps in a less than optimal fashion. And then we talk about the human dimension of crisis management, that total honesty and clarity of focus is incredibly important when it comes to crisis management. And we share some examples of where in a crisis, business leaders were less than candid, less than honest, and the challenge that created. So we finish up with the human dimension. And then finally, as we are wrapping up this entire program, we pull everything together into a description that we call the integrated strategic leader. An integrated strategic leader has great self-awareness, focuses both on leading themselves and leading others and leading the organization. So we talk through what that looks like what we've observed with high-performing integrated strategic leaders. We ask the senior leaders to think for a moment about what they stand for as a leader. This really is about you, the leader, as an individual. What do you stand for? What do you want to be known for? You can call it your personal brand if you want to, or you can simply call it what you stand for. But we give them some time to think about what legacy do they want to leave? What do they want to be known for? What do they want to stand for? This is an individual exercise, and we don't necessarily prompt them to share with others right now. If they want to share, they're absolutely welcome to, but mostly we want to give them some time for self-reflection, and then we ask them to think about, what do you stand for as an organization? Your team, your business, your organization, what do you stand for? And we have a discussion. There is oftentimes the aspirational, what we want to stand for is this. What we actually stand for right now is perhaps still a good thing, but something a bit short of our ultimate or optimal goal, which is, again, if we embrace the brutal reality that there's a gap between what we want to stand for and what we actually stand for, it's best to embrace the gap and acknowledge it, because then you're more likely to do something about it. Um, and then finally, we finish up with this whole process. How do you apply strategic learning and strategic adaptation to yourself? So we take this model and we apply it at a very personal level as a way of almost cementing the process into their minds before we finally wrap up. If you have any questions or want to learn more about Infopro Learning's Strategic Leadership Program, you know where to find me.